Chapter 6. Unusual Bait. As Frank Hardy heard the crunching sound of the planks collapsing beneath the car, the thought flashed through his mind, "Keep going, it's our only chance." Instantly he pushed the gas pedal to the floor. There was a whine of rubber on wood and splintering sounds. The back end of the convertible seemed to shudder and sink. Then at the last second the spinning tires caught hold, and the convertible lurched forward and was out of danger, on the other side of the bridge. "Whew!" exclaimed Frank, stopping the car. "What did I tell you, Chet? I should have let you cross the bridge by yourself." But Chet was too thankful for their narrow escape to retort. Joe was already out of the car. "Let's have a look around," he urged. Firmly taking hold of the iron railings, the brothers ventured out onto the bridge. 2 planks dangled toward the dark water. One was missing entirely. "We'll have to do something," Joe declared, "to warn the other drivers." Crossing to the opposite bank, Frank and Joe set up a temporary roadblock by rolling some logs down from the wooded hillside. Meanwhile, Chet arranged a line of good-sized rocks to close off the bridge on the other end. "We must report this as soon as we come to a phone," Joe remarked. For more than a mile the road continued through wooded hills. At last the boys reached a farmhouse. On the rural mailbox was the name Wynne. Frank explained the situation at the bridge to the family, who had just sat down to an early supper. Immediately the father left the table to phone the police. "Such a narrow escape, boys," the mother declared sympathetically. "Won't you sit a while and eat something with us?" Frank answered courteously, "Thanks a lot, Miss Wynne, but we want to make the animal auction in town before it closes." As the boys said a friendly goodbye to the family, they resumed their trip. 15 minutes later they passed a large sign, "Animal Auction," just ahead on the right. In a moment, Frank had pulled into the parking area next to several red buildings and pens. The trio jumped from the car and entered the high building, with ramps of seats rising steeply to the roof. Men in working clothes occupied the seats, and from a platform at one end of the building, a skinny man in a vest and shirt sleeves was speaking in a loud, ringing voice. The auctioneer was showing his audience the good points of a young workhorse. Next, the assistant led out a brown and white heifer. "These are the larger animals," Frank observed. "The dogs must be in another building." Frank, Joe, and Chet made their way to the door. Suddenly, Joe clutched his brother's arm. Without speaking, he pointed up into the tiers of seats. Among the farmers and stockmen sat a tall man with alert, piercing eyes and a full mustache. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a well-cut sports jacket. "Don't you recognize him?" Joe insisted. For a moment, all 3 boys stared up at the tall, commanding figure. Suddenly, the man's sharp eyes encountered their own. Feeling that they had embarrassed the man by staring at him, the boys went outside. "That was Colonel Thunder, the puma trainer from Clatch's Carnival," declared Joe. "What's he doing at an auction of domestic animals?" "Search me," Chet answered. "Let's try here." He led the way into a long, low building filled with assorted sounds. Chickens cackled, dogs barked, pigs squealed, goats and lambs bleated. The long-eared rabbits hopped about in cages, watching the commotion with twitching noses. The dogs, mostly working and hunting breeds, were at the end of the room. Chet passed the coleys and the shepherds that might be used for herding, and headed for the hounds with their long ears and soft, expressive eyes. "I've always wanted a good hound dog," he said enthusiastically. "Let's see, what shall we get? A coonhound? No, too big. Bloodhound? Too gloomy. Basset? Too fat. Its legs are too short." "Look who's talking," Joe teased. But Chet was too busy to hear. "Say, will you look at that, fellas?" he pointed. In the corner stood a boy about 11 years old. 6 fat, half-grown puppies were scrambling about his legs. "Beagles!" Chet commented, indicating the broad backs, short legs, and pointed tails. Suddenly, one of the pups bounded across the floor and began to nuzzle Chet's trouser leg. As the boy bent down, the beagle's long red tongue licked his hand frantically. "This has to be the one," Chet declared happily, lifting the pup into his arms. "Come here, little fella." "We'll take him," Frank said to the young owner. "How much?" $5, the boy replied. "Sold," agreed Frank, and took out his wallet. As he selected a bill, his attention was distracted by his brother, who quietly touched his elbow. With a nod, Joe indicated a transaction taking place a few stalls away. The man that they had seen in the other building, Colonel Thunder, seemed to be buying sheep. "Friend of yours?" asked the boy with the pups. "No, we've just seen him someplace before." "Well, he's getting cheated," the boy snickered. "That sheep's so old it can hardly stand on its legs. Why would anybody buy a critter like that?" "Just what I'm wondering," Joe murmured, as the boys walked out with our puppy. "Why does Colonel Thunder need a sheep? To feed his pumas?" Once in the car, the little beagle began to tremble violently. "He'll be all right," Chet assured them. "Just the first time he's been away from his brothers and sisters." Kind-hearted Chet allowed the new pet to snuggle up inside his sweater. As Frank started the car, he said, "I want to get back to the cabin. There's a chance that Captain Maguire may have returned." They traveled a few miles over the bumpy road when Frank suddenly stopped the car and exclaimed in annoyance, "What's the matter with me? We can't go back this way. The bridge is out." "We'll have to find another route to Black Hollow," Joe said. After turning around in a farm lane, Frank consulted the road map for a few minutes, and then he headed back toward the auction. At the next town, the boys stopped to eat, and as they set off again, the roads improved. It was now about 7 o'clock. The sun was still high, but the air was pleasantly cool. Traffic became increasingly heavy. Many cars were filled with entire families, all going in the same direction. "Wonder where these people are headed," mused Joe. "Most of them are dressed up." "There's your answer," returned his brother. Just ahead of them, beside the highway, appeared a familiar line of tents. Soon the wind brought the sound of the loudspeakers to their ears. "Clatch's Carnival has a new location," Frank observed. "Good, let's stop in," Chet proposed. "I could use some peanuts and some popcorn." Frank looked sternly at their chunky friend from one side, and Joe looked sternly at him from the other. "Oh, I was kidding, fellas," he said. "What I really want to see is that puma act again." "Well, that's better," Frank admitted. "I'd like to see it again myself." After parking, the three friends made their way to Colonel Thunder's show tent. Chet carried the now content puppy inside his sweater. "I just thought of something," he said. "Do you suppose the Colonel will be here? We just saw him at the auction." "Don't worry," Joe answered. "He had time to get here while we were driving in the wrong direction." Sure enough, the Colonel's amazing act was already in progress when the trio entered. The tall trainer, wearing the same white outfit, managed the dangerous cats with the same daring disregard for the puma that had always remained directly behind his back. This time, however, the performance went off without a hitch. As the crowd climbed down from the bleachers and filed out, Joe pushed forward to the cage for a closer look at the pumas. They were sleek beasts, strong, young, and well fed. At the same moment, Colonel Thunder emerged from the cage through a small door right next to Joe. "Some animals you have there," Joe remarked to the man. "What kind of food do you give them to eat?" "Raw meat that we get from the local butchers," the Colonel replied. He spoke politely, but his manner was distant, and he walked away immediately. "But we saw him buying that sheep at the auction," Joe protested, as the boys drove homeward. "If it was to feed his pumas, why didn't he mention it?" When Frank pulled up to the cabin, it was almost 9 o'clock. The sun was gone and the woods were dark, but overhead the sky remained luminous in the afterglow. The boys, half hopeful that their host had returned, entered the cabin, but the place was silent. Frank's note lay undisturbed on the kitchen table. Captain Maguire had not returned. "Where is he?" Joe burst out. "We must find him, and soon." Suddenly Frank held up his hand. "Listen, outside! A car!" The boys ran to the porch. In the clearing, an automobile's parking lights gleamed. A plump little man in a business suit got out, slammed the door to the car, and walked rapidly toward them. "Where's Maguire?" he demanded, in an irritable voice that matched his rather dour face. "Not here just now," Frank answered noncommittally. "Not here? Where is he then? He owes me some money." "I'll tell him you were around," said Frank. "What's your name?" "Weber. Wyckoff Weber. He knows." "I'm an attorney in Forestburg." "An attorney?" Joe spoke up. "Maybe you can tell us about Black Hollow, Mr. Weber. It belongs to the Donners, doesn't it?" "Yes. They used to have summer cottages down in it, but the place burned down. Haven't seen a Donner around here since." "What do you make of the witch story?" Frank asked. For a second, the lawyer's eyes shifted away before he replied. "A lot of nonsense. The hollow has peculiar, reverberating qualities. Somebody screaming miles away could be heard here, and clearly, too." "I see. Well, we'll give Captain Maguire your message, Mr. Weber." As the lawyer's car pulled away, Joe observed, "That's one fellow I wouldn't trust for 2 minutes." Chet now hurried to give their pet some milk and meat scraps. As the little dog ate hungrily, Frank said, "I'm going to test out what Weber told us. Sounded phony to me. I'll drive around to the opposite rim and yell. The wind is blowing in this direction. You fellas stay here and listen. When I get there, I'll blink the car's headlights." Frank drove off to circle around the far side of Black Hollow. End of chapter 6.